Hello and welcome to this session of the World University Summit on Universities of the Future, a global partnership for social justice and sustainable development. And this session is going to be focusing on the role of universities in the age of disinformation and misinformation. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and give you an overview of what this discussion is going to be about. I'm KAJORI, Associate Professor of Practice with Jindal Global University's Jindal School of Journalism and Communications, and I will be moderating the session. We have Professor Dawn Freshwater, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Auckland, a globally recognized leader in world-class universities for more than a decade, joining us now. She became the university's first female Vice Chancellor in March of 2020, after serving as the University of Western Australia's Vice Chancellor and the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor and Registrar. Professor Freshwater was the first female chair of the Group of 8 research-intensive universities in Australia. She's currently Deputy Chair of Research Australia, Vice Chair of the Asia Pacific Rim Universities, Chair of the UNZ Research Committee, and past Chair of the Partnership Board of the World University Network. Professor Freshwater was awarded her PhD at the University of Nottingham, and her contribution to the fields of public health, especially mental health and forensic mental health, and in researching leadership practices, have won her the highest honors in her field. We also have joining us Professor SAIKAT MAJUMDAR, a professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University, the author of College Pathways of Possibility, a book on liberal arts education in India. He's also written Prose of the World, a book of literary criticism, and 4 novels, most recently The Middle Finger, a college campus novel. He has taught previously at Stanford University, was a Newhouse Fellow at Wellesley College, a Fellow at Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study, and writes regularly on higher education in different venues, including the Times Higher Education. We've got with us Professor Angelia Wilson, who's the Associate Dean for Internationalisation and a Professor of Politics at the University of Manchester. Professor Wilson leads in establishing global partnerships for research and teaching collaborations with a commitment to equitable, meaningful, and productive relationships between institutions. Professor Wilson's own research considers the role of information and disinformation shared through social networks and the impact of that on social cohesion, including in the context of higher education. And last but of course not least, we have Professor Dennis LEIGHTON, Professor and Dean in the Jindal School of Languages and Literature, Jindal Global University. He worked at University of Delhi and at Ambedkar University, Delhi for more than 15 years before joining Jindal Global University. He's also been on the faculty of several US colleges and universities since 1990, having taught and researched in several areas of history, European studies, and global studies. He has been the recipient of several fellowships and research grants, and his major monographic publications include The Greenian Moment, T.H. Green, Religion and Political Argument in Victorian Britain, and Lives of Victorian Political Figures, Part 4, which is J.S. Mill, Walter Bagehot, William Morris, and T.H. Green. So he has worked on editorial boards for journals of cultural studies, language and literature studies, and history, and regularly evaluates book manuscripts, and does, of course, much, much more. So with our panel introduced, let me take you through what it is that we are going to be broadly focusing on. And to start with, I think we need to look at where we stand on the issue of misinformation and disinformation, what that means, and where academia specifically intersects with it. So the internet has, of course, changed the way that all of us interact with information in general. Not just the news, but also how we look for information, which sources we go to for information, how we engage and disseminate that information. Perhaps the morning news may still have a certain degree of validity, but more and more people, and increasingly younger and younger people, are getting most of their information from various sources on the internet, some more dubious than the others. As we see this kind of shift taking place, the question that is being raised is, what kind of work is going into examining these spaces, and how can we counteract the kind of hype and hyperbole and sometimes deliberate sources of wrong clickbaity news that appears across the board? Now, at the very least, we are losing nuance. At the very most, we are being deceived in absolutely all forms of information that is being available to us. When it comes to academia, on one hand, we are training the young people of today and tomorrow to be aware of what it is that they are reading, to critically and with a very nuanced eye look at that information which is being put out there, to create an environment of media literacy. It is also our responsibility to ensure that we put out work that counteracts what is happening in the larger domain. But how do we make it accessible? How do we make it readable? And how do we ensure that digital literacy trickles down with a true industry connect? That's a conversation that we're going to be having here today. And for that, let's start off with opening remarks from our speakers, get a sense of where they stand on this issue and how their experiences in teaching as well as research has worked in the space, particularly over the last few years. Professor Freshwater, if we could start with you.
Sure, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It sounds like a very exciting panel we're about to be part of. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. What a privilege it is to join you for this important conversation. And I think what you've done, KAJORI, is lay out the issues around misinformation, disinformation, but more broadly, the concerns that we have around, what constitutes opinion, what constitutes fact, what is the role of the expert and expertise in current society and in the current zeitgeist, and what is this sort of the pandemic that we are coming out of has also spawned another pandemic, several pandemics. Misinformation and disinformation was around before COVID-19, but of course now we see the proliferation of it. I want to come to the point you made around what are we doing? So just some broad comments. Of course, we're all very aware we're living in an infodemic age. None of us are immune. My inbox is cluttered constantly. I'm sure lots of people's are, with lots of information, some of which, and it is a bit of a deluge, some of which is critically important, some of which requires my attention, but actually we have to make lots of judgment calls about what's coming through a myriad of largely online channels, which means that we're confronted by volumes of incorrect, misleading information, and sometimes, as we know, deliberately deceptive information that's propagated. And I'm sure the panelists will have more to say about that definition. But what we do know is that the COVID-19 pandemic fueled that infodemic. And, let's remember some of that for the good. Really important to get that information out there and to get the information that's widespread so that we can make informed decisions and continue to be a functioning society and to contain, all of the challenges that we face, not just pandemics, but COVID-19 was one, but climate justice, a whole range of things within a functioning society that is cohesive. We as universities play a critical part in that. And our communities look to us, not only for the expertise and facts, but for the research and the insights. And importantly, KAJORI, they look to us for honest dialogue. We need to be fundamentally trustworthy and trusted. So, I think this is a great conversation to be having at this conference because it is a bit of a menace that we're facing, another menace. What we're doing at the University of Auckland as part of our relationship with the Asia Pacific Rim universities relates to the development of an infodemic initiative. And this goes back to 2022. We've developed a misinformation resilience index. The index is publicly available using publicly available data on social media usage. It looks at trust in science as one of its variables, and it looks at legislative actions across more than 30 countries, and India was one of those countries, importantly. The index itself is a composite score for a population's exposure and resilience to misinformation. Now, as it stands, the index relates to COVID-19, but we are going to extend the index to look at information around sustainability, climate change, to look at health information, and to look at economic information. If you go back to the COVID-19 data that we collected across those 30 countries, guess what? There was a remarkable correlation between the index and vaccine uptake. No correlation was found when the index was tested with a country's economic well-being. But if you look at our case studies, I'll say a little bit about those and then conclude. What we're saying here through the research and the work we did in the development of the index is that, of course, misinformation, disinformation correlated with low vaccine uptake. That did have an impact on economies, and it did have an impact on health systems. So the case studies were in Australia, China, Hong Kong, and Singapore. They particularly supported the feasibility of the index, but underscored the need for further refinement. So we're moving on to refine the index by establishing transparent methodologies and data collection. We want to expand its applicability, as I've said. And when we think about what's currently happening in civil society and public discourse, and we cannot think about this panel outside of that context of misinformation and disinformation, civil society and public discourse has been negatively impacted by contradictions, clashes, conflicts about the pandemic and vaccines, but also, of course, climate change, how to preserve democracies, and many more things. Our colleagues are from diverse disciplines, and we're looking at multidisciplinary ways of addressing some of the mixed results that we're getting and that we want to further explore. So that's part of the work that we're doing, and we've recently submitted a proposal for a significant research grant. We think it will be beneficial to gain a coherent, unified framework that explains generalized contradictions across countries and recognize that individuals and societies revise their beliefs on information that, although is at everybody's fingertips, might be manipulated by self-interested agents. And that's obviously been, propaganda through populism as well. We believe that an individual's positioning in society and how they actually revise beliefs that challenge worldviews should assist us in explaining their origin and the persistence of apparent contradictions. So it's very exciting. It is transdisciplinary. It takes in mathematical modeling, network theories, experimental economics, computational methods, and cognitive psychology. We're also, of course, mindful of using AI as part of this study. We are also mindful that AI is part of the problem. So, quite an interesting place to end, because some of the material that we're relying on collecting is also part of the issue. And I think that's really a real conflict for universities. We're hoping to inform the design of novel information filters to restore high quality public discourse and assist in sound policy decision making. That's my research insight, KAJORI. Of course, we continue to use a range of channels for public dialogue, and this is one of them. Happy to take questions, but really looking forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to you shortly, Professor Freshwater, I think, but that's laid out a lot of the major themes and questions around misinformation and disinformation, particularly the idea of trust and trust building. Professor LEIGHTON, we'll go to you next and get your take and opening remarks.
Yes, thank you. Professor Freshwater has certainly given a very relevant introduction here, given the prompts that we were supplied with for this session, which of course deal with a number of different issues, including dishonesty in academic institutions themselves with regard to publishing and collection of data and so on. And certainly what the University of Auckland has done, particularly in the way of providing this, working through this misinformation vulnerability index, is very relevant to all of these issues. I would, I think, like to take it back a step and without oversimplifying too much, just look at issues of data and information. It was about 50 years ago that an economist, Herbert Simon, told us that a wealth of information produces a poverty of attention, which I think is just as true today as it was, certainly more true today than it was 50 years ago, given the way we are bombarded through various media, particularly social media and even the established media channels. As someone whose vision is perhaps a little bit more confined to call them problems of the classroom and problems of the academic environment, or challenges of teaching and trying to achieve understanding of various issues within an academic environment. Of course, most of our universities offer particular courses or even teaching modules in different programs on media literacy, data literacy, how to survive or deal with the infodemic and so on. And I still find inspiring the pronouncement of a Chancellor of the University of California system nearly 60 years ago, Clark Kerr, who during controversies in his university system about free speech and student activism and so on, proclaimed that the function of a university is not to make ideas safe for people, but to make people safe for ideas. Making people safe for ideas, I think, is a role that all universities need to take very seriously. And it's just as much an issue now as it was 50 years ago, or even 100 years ago. Media literacy, data literacy, of course, is something that we hope that we are teaching our students. And of course, the further step, as it were, of playing a kind of ameliorative role within society is a very challenging one. And I'm not going to go into the various successful and unsuccessful campaigns or measures that have been taken in recent years. But again, focusing on the university, we're of course challenged by issues of free speech and of getting students seriously involved, as we say, in my university at least, getting students seriously engaged in their learning, trying to cut through indifference and confusion and so on. And I think that's quite a difficult task as it is, set aside, trying to perform this larger role within society. So again, the prompts that were suggested to us for this panel, span a range of issues, including questions or challenges of academic honesty within publishing, and making sure that researchers, teachers are not unduly pressured to produce fast, quick, meaningful research, often through dubious means. I half the time I don't know whether to laugh or to cry about the things that one discovers or reads about in the media, the latest atrocity or catastrophe, mechanisms for automatically increasing citations of one's work and so on. These are all very serious issues. But I think media literacy and data literacy are issues and problems that need to be taken up in a very serious way by universities. And I think most of our institutions have been doing that to a very large extent. I don't really have more to say in the way of opening comments, but I'm very attentive to what my fellow panelists have to say about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leighton. And of course, the question there about what it is that we're doing in the classroom and how pedagogies are changing to look at not teaching information, but countering misinformation, and how critical that becomes, something we will definitely return to later on in the conversation. Professor Wilson, opening comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, KAJORI, for setting out the questions for the panel, and to my fellow panelists, and for Jindal to hosting the conference. I've enjoyed listening to my panelists and to thinking about these issues as you set out for the panel. You said this phrase, a polarized world, about a polarized world doesn't do nuance, and I think that's very important for us to all remember. I think in my opening comments, what I want to do is think about threats and think about how we as HE, as higher education institutions, may combat those threats. Part of what I do, as you said, in my own research, is to look at political strategies and thinking about those threats, and then how we combat them is sometimes how I come to these. So I want to talk about drivers of misinformation. And drivers of misinformation, I'll just identify 3 of those to start with, that I hope we can come back to some of these. First of all, generally speaking, when the world is shifting to the right, as many Western democracies have, when the world is shifting to the right, it is a normal practice of the right to question elites, to question educated elites and intellectuals. So that's a part, we need to kind of recognize that that's just a part of kind of what's going on in the wider political context, that is a normal process to question political elites, intellectual elites. And within that, and alongside that now, we have tech that is happy to produce facts. Someone had to get to the quotation marks with our fingers at some point. That tech will help us produce facts. And they will also, tech helps us produce experts in some sort of way. I know some of you mentioned about AI in the classroom, and I've been marking essays, some of which I worry are ChatGPT essays rather than engaged essays from students. So what we know is AI produces facts and produces some sort of random experts that may not actually have much expertise. And then another kind of threat, the kind of third threat that I want to look at is the investment then from the right. So and it's not just the political right, but in many cases, those are the ones questioning elites at a university. Is the investment from the outside in things like a chair of X, Y, and Z, or a research group for X, Y, and Z. Given the financial state of much HE institutions, it is tempting to take that money and go, oh yes, that's an investment in the institution. And I think we need to think about resisting that, but especially if it's, oh, we'll give you this money in order to produce research that we like, in order to produce that research that goes along with our political stance. And I think there's been quite a lot of that in some institutions around the world, where there's investment in particular areas in order to produce certain kinds of quote unquote facts. So I'm going to just leave that kind of threats that I see out there and how that may undermine social cohesion. I want to talk just a moment then about, I think I have 4 areas of how HE might combat that. And I'll take that from some of the lessons that we've learned at and the work that we do at the University of Manchester. So part of the concern that the right brings is that, well, knowledge production is an elitist activity. So how do we combat that? Is to make knowledge production less elitist. It's pretty obvious. So first of all, we need to do that in who we accept into our institutions. Yes, the University of Manchester is a Russell Group institution in the UK, but we also have the highest acceptance rates of widening participation students in the UK. So how do we reach out to those communities and make sure that we're not just perpetuating the social structures that we have? So as HE institutions, we can think about who we accept into study, making sure, of course, that we get good quality students, but that we're not always going back to the same private schools to accept undergraduate students. Secondly, we can think about how we engage with our community. And by our community, I mean both our academic community. So how do we teach our academics to engage with policymakers? How do we teach our academics to engage with the media? So at the University of Manchester, we have something called Policy at Manchester that literally teaches, okay, if you're working on something, how do we get you in front of the policymakers that are working on that same area? How do we get the hottest, latest research into, how do we, I don't want to be the first one to bash academics, but the first thing I'll say about all my lovely academic colleagues across the world is most of them, not all of them, but most of them struggle with social skills, shall we say. You know, we are trained to be in a library working really hard, or in our offices working very hard on our solitary projects. And so maybe we all need to go, okay, we need a little bit of training about how to come out of our elitist ivory tower and engage with the media or engage with policymakers. And how do we package and discuss our ideas and our latest research in those venues? So how do we engage with the community? And I would say, so that's about the media and policymakers, but how do we also engage with our local communities? So another program that we have at the University of Manchester is called Be Well. Now, you mentioned how my colleague, Vice Chancellor FRESHWATER, mentioned how COVID has led to this increase in information, increase of bad information. One of the things that COVID led to is that we know of is an increase in mental health problems of our young people. And we have a program called Be Well in Manchester. I don't know how much you know about the history of the city of Manchester, but the bee, the insect, the bee, is a symbol of Manchester. And so it's called BEEWELL. And it is a program that reaches out to our local school systems and helps those school systems who may be struggling with mental health support for young people, and importantly, how those young people engage with social media. So how has social media perpetuated a mental health crisis of our young people? And in doing so, they teach them digital skills, digital literacy, how to think about what is fact and what is being sold to you as fact. So that's one program that reaches out. I think now we're in 200 schools in the Greater Manchester area. It's a fantastic program. So the third thing then is about education, both at HE and a little bit before that, maybe in high school, about research methods. I am a big fan of how do we teach research methods? How do we teach people to think? Not how do we teach them to be nuclear scientists? That's great for some, but how do we teach them the basic ideas of scientific research and what is valuable research and what isn't valuable research? That correlation does not mean causation. How do you teach those basic skills to 14, 15, 10-year-olds, you know, and as well as, of course, our own students. And then finally, perhaps is unsurprising, I think we as HE institutions need to be okay in challenging those that question academic freedom, in challenging those that question our expertise. And yes, we absolutely need to have strong ethics committees that check and recheck our own research. But we need to be okay. And the reason I need to say that at the end is because many of us in HE are dependent on whatever government happens to be in office to set the direction for HE, and particularly for HE finances. And we need to, embrace and sing the praises of and be okay defending academic freedom. But we also need to be able to stand up to those that may want to question intellectual expertise on a political basis, even if that's our funders.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. And so the questions being raised there about who we are talking to, how we are talking to them, and how to take that forward. Professor Majumdar, opening comments.
Thank you, KAJORI, and thank you, Jindal, for inviting me. This has been a great discussion, and I think this question of misinformation is literally a question of life and death now. I mean, it's also a question of ignorance, poverty, oppression. It continues to be, but it's extremely urgent. I think to understand that, we need to think about how did we come to this? I think questions of economics and technology are all there. But there's something fundamental has shifted ideologically. And for that, we need to examine the category of post-truth. How did this phrase post-truth become so powerful? When did truth become vulnerable? When did truth become a subject of debate? And I think Professor Wilson has already pointed to that I think right-wing governments have a clear relationship to kind of questioning expertise, science. And I think we heard the expression post-truth for the first time during the Trump election, that, oh, now we don't decide based on truth, we've gone beyond truth, emotions and opinions matter. And, just the way the whole idea that this is connected to right-wing demagoguery, it's actually profoundly ironic for humanists. And many of us are humanists here, especially those of us who imagine ourselves as progressive humanists, because we've been actually questioning truth for the longest time. This is the biggest irony. It's come back to haunt us, that we've been saying things like truth is a construct of power, truth as it's constructed in the European Enlightenment, and reason and science, there's invisible structures of power in truth. It's masculine, it's white, it's feudal, bourgeois, upper class. Now, truth has been questioned from decolonial, feminist, anti-racist perspectives, because, truth is not just simple. There are other structures behind it. And, thinkers like Michel Foucault and Thomas Kuhn has variously pointed out that truth and science are not as objective as it seems. They're not as, you can't trust them simply. Michel Foucault has talked about the episteme that, the zeitgeist really shapes. Thomas Kuhn has talked about structures of scientific knowledge that, don't trust truth. Truth hides structures of power. But, I was thinking of when the philosopher Bruno Latour said something very interesting in the early 21st century, that, oh, now we have Republicans saying that climate change is a social construct. Now, like, whoa, wait a minute. We are supposed to say things like that. We say things like, is gender a social construct, sexuality a social construct? Now you're kind of almost using the methodology of the left to defend a position in the right. So you can see that the sort of a culture of questioning truth had a certain tradition of ideological support for the longest time, except that ideological support came from the left. But now that is actually conveniently moving on to the right. And, there's an element of humanities versus science debate there. Humanists have always said the importance of the subjective, the opinion, we don't want to go by just facts. But that is not the moot. That has become moot now. And obviously, this is 2024. Latour wrote this in 2004. Nobody's saying now that climate change is a social construct. It's all very real around us. Climate change deniers have to be absolutely in the kind of loony bin extreme. But the point is, what has happened is there's a certain valorization of opinion over truth. And I think I completely agree with what was said before, that there's a sense of knowledge and expertise as elite. I think that's exactly right, that somehow the distrust has come into being. And what I say, and this is like really kind of saddens me to say this, there's this kind of this perverse victory of humanities. It's really sad. Here we are, humanities losing funding and all that. But in the public sphere, in the sphere of democracy, I want people to say that, vote according to data, vote according to economics, vote according to science, but they're voting for stories. They're voting for stories. And it's like, and obviously that's also very perverse, because we have just one, when you have one story, one religion, one past, then it's really not a victory for humanities, really. When you install, kind of one version of religion in a temple, then what happens to the other possibilities? And I think the same thing has been happening worldwide. Again, the question of expertise. I think Brexit, all my English friends have been saying, and I'm sure, a colleague speaking from England can stand to that, there was a whole divide between south of England and central and north England. And there was a kind of a victory of nationalism over economics, that there's a sort of chauvinistic idea of what we want versus what is actually economically good for England. And I think several years after Brexit, we've realized that it hasn't actually been such a good thing. Research has been had. And I think this is, of course, greatly accelerated by technology. Traditional technology was in few hands. There were a few gatekeepers, but that was the same. I mean, every age in technology opens things up. Every age, there was print was also opening up of books as middle class beyond manuscripts, which had just in the hands of the feudals or the aristocrats or the church. Benedict Anderson wrote about how the printed newspaper really created an imagined community across the nation. But the digital technology has gone far beyond that, which we all know. Anybody can publish and disseminate. And the gatekeeping powers are really gone. I mean, we have a generation of young people today who trust the New York Times as much as a blog post or a social media post, or any of the newspapers here in India or anywhere. So I think So what has happened is this has become democratic, but it's also really uneven quality. And this is, of course, great damage to science and reason. Technology has also opened up the power to fake and doctor videos. And as Professor Freshwater pointed out, the 2 years of the pandemic has been deadly, because obviously, we've been kind of in our bubble. And I think this is where I think it's really a kind of an uphill job to kind of re-establish that universities are a unique place of expertise. And I don't just mean hard expertise as technical and professional, but also the soft expertise, a certain kind of imagination, certain impersonal skills, certain life enriching skills. And this is where the job is very complicated, because in a bipolar world, there's a natural distrust of elites. There's a natural distrust of expertise. And I think, for instance, there are different problems in different parts. I think in the US, the university, which was very much a local entity as it started, the local college, has lost that support because of partly due to high tuition fees, partly due to political. I think in India, we have a very unique situation where we have a very high youth population. So universities and colleges are very high in demand, and we can make a real difference. But we see the same thing here, deep political polarization. We keep hearing things like anti-national, universities are anti-national. And I think there's really important, I think what was said, that we have to somehow reestablish that faith, that trust. And some of us, who write in the media, as a novelist, I'm always dealing with a kind of a public life. We are always work at interacting with kind of larger platforms. And I think that is something really worth thinking about, that restoring of the trust is actually the uphill task, but that's what we need to know. And truth, it's important to question truth, but not at the expense of life and death. Stop there for now.
Right. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. And I think from what all four of you have said, there are three main points that we need to focus on taking this discussion forward. One, of course, is what the universities do in the classroom. The second is what universities do with public stakeholders. And third is what universities do with their own publications and their own administrative and academic strategies. So let's pick up on each of these themes. And let's start with first the question of, and I think Dennis brought this up, so I'm going to go to him on this one and let him elaborate on it a little bit. The question of academic responsibility, academic misconduct, the environment of publish or perish. Where does academia itself find itself in relation to ideas of truth and information?
Thank you. If this is an opportunity for me to intervene. Yes, I myself had mentioned this at the beginning of my opening remarks about some of the malpractice within academic institutions themselves. Of course, publish or perish is a very well-established syndrome in academia. It's not just a product of the infodemic or anything like that. It's been with us for a long time. My own view is that we academics and administrators are largely responsible for this. I don't really think that there are overwhelming external political forces that have pushed academic higher education institutions into this kind of situation where we're constantly worried about how much we publish, who's reading it, and so on, who's aware of our research and who's making use of it and who's making use of it responsibly, and so on. But to connect this to some comments of other panelists about reestablishing the university as a place of expertise, Professor Wilson had mentioned this also, and she told us about, I think, the quite worthy efforts made by the University of Manchester to reach out to have a, as we say, a proactive role, even at the level of primary and secondary education, teaching data literacy, information literacy, media literacy, that sort of thing.
Seems we may be having some trouble there with Professor Leighton's connection. Until we can get him back online, I am going to put a pin on that and open possibly that conversation up to our other panelists as well. Actually, Professor Freshwater, I was about to take the next question to you, and it is building on what we were just talking about, which is that universities need to, and you talked about what your university has been doing and what sort of the larger academic space has been doing with the Group of 8 and other sort of research networks, about leveraging the expertise available and making it accessible to larger spaces. How do you feel that this can be taken forward?
Yeah, let me start first of all, KAJORI, by going backwards a little bit on that first question, because I think the whole issue of academic misconduct, misinformation, and disinformation is actually a serious risk for universities at a time when we are already seeing threats and challenges to higher education as a sector and as a concept. And I thought that SAIKAT was really on the nose with this, because when you start to question, truth and the elites, we're right in the middle of all of that, of course. And then if we start to perpetuate misinformation and the academic mission is undermined by our own colleagues, then, talk about scoring an own goal or hitting our own wicket. We are really putting ourselves in the firing line there. So I think it's a very significant risk for us. I'm not sure that we've really tackled it. Our research involves collaborations. We've got to work across different academic institutions. There's always a risk of integrity being compromised of research and research data. But we're heavily focused on student plagiarism at the moment. And, ANGELIA mentioned ChatGPT. We're doing a lot on that. But the reality is that we have to also start looking in our own backyard and understanding what it is that we're going to do to ensure that our own methodologies, that our own approaches, that our own techniques of really surfacing high quality data to make informed decisions is as transparent and clean as it can be. Now, your question about leveraging the expertise available within the institution, blend it with technology, I think this is a really great concept. So, we're doing quite a lot of work on move a little bit away from science communication, think about the media literacy. We're doing a little bit of work on reaching out into our communities. And of course, universities have been really engaged in public lectures and working across their cultural precincts. This is something that's done very well in other institutions as well. And engaging with their local Indigenous population. I just wanted to, because SAIKAT, really, I think you were touching on this as well, colonization, decolonization, and the understanding of truth. And reaching for us, we have Maori and Pacific communities that we work with, reaching into those communities and working collaboratively to really try and make sure that we are sharing not so much information, but helping people to lift the skills of critical thinking, to understand, moral reasoning, and to really address some of the issues today that we have, which you've pointed out, are people getting their information from social media? How are they making decisions? What are their judgments? What are they fact checking against? What are the moral compasses that they're using? Where are the values-led conversations coming from? How is it made contextualized? How is that data and information contextualized? There is no nuance. And so I think what I would say about leveraging the expertise we have available, blending it with technology, is that we need to think, well, okay, digital literacy has grown enormously. That's an opportunity to really build broad skills of critical thinking, of moral reasoning, of using your judgment and learning how to apply data in the service of decision making that has, humanity at the end of it, not the other way around. So that's what I would say. And I think the other thing is, we need to remember that our students are far brighter than us. And we need to engage our students in this process. They will tell us how to do this, but we also need to help them to understand the parameters of knowledge generation, evidence, fact, and opinion.
Professor Wilson, if we pick up on that theme and pick up actually on what you were saying in your opening comments, which was about making academia accessible to the larger population, which of course is the first step in that trust building exercise that we've all been talking about here. So in that context, how would you see that process beginning?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that I've from the discussion that I want to pick up. One is making academia accessible, making us not look so elite, in that making our research ethics procedures much more transparent for the outside world. You know, when we have many of my colleagues will moan on a daily basis about how long it takes to get a project through the University of Manchester Ethics Committee. They are constantly moaning about how long that takes. But what I will tell you is the reason that takes so long is because they are meticulous. It is a cross-disciplinary ethics committee. They are constantly looking from the science perspective, from a social science perspective, about whether or not this is valid, solid, good research that is safe for the researcher, but is also producing worthy and valuable research. So being honest about that, saying we have as HE institutions robust ethical procedures that we put our research projects through. So therefore you can trust the research that we're producing. I do think that Dennis was right in mentioning about the climate in terms of publishing and the need to publish in order to get promoted for academics. I'm all for having publications as a significant indicator of if you're engaged in producing new ideas and engaged in expertise at a research institution. That's great. I do worry about two things. One is the emergence of pay to publish, where anybody can pay £1,000 and get their article published in some sort of academic journal or something that, let's say, looks like an academic journal. And I do worry about the impact of that on our community. I know some young academics will be suckered into kind of paying for that and doing that in order to get something on their CV. And I think we need to really fight back against that. The reason academic journals are hard to get into is because the robustness of the peer review process. And that makes sure that on the whole, there is not, in those peer-reviewed journals, that there are not publications that are about bad research, unethical research, or, you know, and I know there's been one or two in the media that have come through, but, you know, that's one or two. It is not by any means the standard of peer-reviewed academic journals. The other thing, as much as, again, it's, you know, 2:15 in the morning, so I'm going to be safe to say this in the UK, hoping that all of my colleagues are sleeping. But there are many problems with what we in the UK know as the REF, but ways in which we are assessed as universities about our research output. But one of the things that has come out of the REF that has been positive, not many, but one of the things that has been positive is that robustness of internal peer review and making sure that the research that's published is good, solid pieces of research. So we need to be a bit more public about that and say, hang on a minute, we are producing fantastic research that's peer reviewed at various stages and that we can trust. And therefore, not only can we trust it, but you as a community of the media and of our peers can trust that as well. And the second thing I'll say is a concern about us being a bit more robust in the public square about calling out those that are producing research or curriculum that is not up to scratch, that is politically motivated. So I assume many of you know what PragerU is. So PragerU has used this term, university, and completely undermined it. By producing something that's called PragerU, it makes, you know, I have an aunt in the middle of Texas who is convinced that PragerU is the same as the University of Manchester. you know, that those are both universities. They say the word university, so they must both be the same. Now, the worry there is that PragerU is now being, the classes that are the curriculum that's put together by PragerU is now being used in classrooms in America. In educational, high school, primary schools are adopting the curriculum from PragerU. And so we as an HE institution, but as educationalists, need to say, hang on a minute, that is politically motivated, that is propaganda, that is not something that is based on truth. So going back to your question about how do we come out of the ivory tower and be less elite, one of those is to be transparent about our robustness, and the second one is to call out those that simply aren't.
Right. We've got an audience question, and Professor Majumdar, I'm going to take this one to you because I think it picks up on what you were already talking about. It's a fairly despairing audience question because it says the spaces for where we can combat misinformation are shrinking. It is in the interest of certain forms of institutions, politicians, certain branches of the media to not combat disinformation, in which case where and how do we then put the truth out, and how do we seek it? And even if we know the truth, what do we do with it if the spaces where we can speak or act on it are shrinking?
Well, I wish we all knew the answer to that, but for this interest of time, I'll confine the response to what the situation we have in South Asia, because I think there have been some kind of scandalous cases of plagiarism with top US administrators. But I think here what is happening is, the way I look at it is the whole reason to publish and perish really goes back to the German research university pioneered by William Humboldt. And I think in India, we never quite had that system. We had a more colonial university system where kind of examination-driven system. And what we've done is we've just kind of, you know, education here is very polarized. Students are just taught to consume knowledge and kind of show it in exams. And then suddenly when it comes to the PhD, you're supposed to produce an original thesis. So this sudden transition from consumption model to production model doesn't really work. I think one thing we can certainly do to inculcate a culture of research and freedom is to start this process early. Something that is done in American universities or even in high schools, that you kind of start the culture of research papers, projects, you know, do not make them passive consumers of knowledge till the masters, and don't keep research productivity for the PhD. And this is something we need to kind of bring it in. And also, you know, it's very complicated because truth and misinformation has a very different relationship in South Asia, where there's a culture of gossip, community. The same individual focus on truth doesn't quite work. Like one thing, you know, international students from Asia are always told when you went to the US, for instance, is that, oh, the individual ownership of truth and idea is very important in the West. And obviously, we all know that plagiarism has cultural functions. In a culture where societies are seen as communal, we help each other, or let's do this together, plagiarism is somehow not taken quite as seriously. So this whole idea, some of this has to go with the whole idea of colonial violence. We've instituted colonial structures of knowledge and that modernity, and there'll be some violence, but there's no going back to it. We have to go with it now. So I think this is, you know, one thing we can certainly do is, and this is something definitely possible pedagogically in the classroom, inculcate research cultures earlier and earlier. So I teach a university-wide foundation course at Ashoka, 100 students. I might give a question in the midterm. For the last assignment, I said, there's no assignment. Go and design your own assignment. I think you have to structure assignments which are kind of plagiarism proof. And I still take pride in saying, if I give you a question, I can assure you, you will not find the answer to this question anywhere on the internet. You have to kind of, so in a way, you have to kind of, rather than policing them, you have to internalize original thinking, which is a bit of a job given the K-12 system in India. But if you actually do it, if you make it organic, and certainly at the elite universities, we are very well positioned to do it. How to democratize it is a bigger question. So once we do that, I think a lot of the problems will start to be answered.
Right. I think, unfortunately, we're just getting into the sort of main themes of this conversation. But in the interest of time, we are I'm going to have to ask for final comments. And I think at this point, I think we need to talk strategies going ahead. So, Professor Freshwater, closing comments from you about strategies going ahead.
Yeah, I think, KAJORI, we've also already mentioned some of the research that we're engaged in. And I think some of the panelists have spoken a bit about what's happening around education and what we're going to do in terms of our teaching and learning. But we have to remember we're part of bigger context, and that we need to think about how we engage at the boundary, you know, that sort of crossing of the threshold from the academy into broader society, and what role we can play in promoting a culture of fact-checking, evidence-based decision-making in society. It's all very well to have policies to cover standards, which we do. We have codes of conduct, all of those sorts of things already exist. But actually what we're talking about here is something much bigger than that, and something much broader that can have real world consequences. And we've spoken a bit about public health, but social stability. You know, this is what SAIKAT was saying right at the beginning, not just life and death, but life and death, you know, real life and death. And so I think that we need to start working together collaboratively as networks of institutions with our partners and with our alumni. Many of our alumni are people who are engaged in big tech. They're regulators, they're lawyers, they're people who are engaged in this. And we have a large group of people to draw on who can help us to think about how we work together to support policymakers in the future, but not to be just rushing to policy making ourselves.
Right. Professor LEIGHTON, strategies going ahead.
Yes, as far as strategies, I don't have any very portable, forceful comments in the ways of recommendation. I would just again go back to what other panelists have said about the dynamic of reestablishing the university as a place of expertise and also making it trusted. Professor MAJUMDAR, for example, talked about, you know, the particular Indian context, the colonial, post-colonial, and that sort of thing. But I think to boil it down into more general kind of global political dynamics, I think higher education institutions, not only in India, but in many other parts of the world, need to push back more, I think, against, you know, kind of gatekeeping regulatory institutions such as the University Grants Commission, Ministry of Human Resources, Education, and so on. Again, I don't want to make some facile comments about, oh, it's all political, but I think it is very political. So I referred earlier to you know, the publish or perish dilemma as being actually a very old one, and it's just has kind of a new wrinkle or a new aspect to it. It suggested that, you know, we're responsible for many of our own problems, but at the same time, we do need to be more skillful, as several other panelists have mentioned, in the way that we respond to particular cues and incentives from our governments about the, you know, the purposefulness of research and so on. And these are not easy problems to tackle, but they're certainly, I think, the key to reestablishing a greater sense of public trust in our institutions as valuable institutions that help them. Yeah.
Right. Professor Wilson, last thoughts.
I know that we're pushed for time, so I'll boil it down to one thing. I think we need to be okay to defending academic freedom, to defending the importance of, broadly speaking, I come from the Faculty of Humanities, so you won't be surprised for me to say this, broadly speaking, defending the liberal arts education. The point of liberal arts education, non-STEM, shall we say, is to teach students critical thinking. It's to teach them how to think, not what to think, but how to think. And guess what? That is directly linked to employability. So yes, STEM gets you a job, but so does learning critical thinking skills.
Right. Thank you. Professor Majumdar, last thoughts.
Yeah, very quickly. I think this whole point of establishing trust in universities, which I think has emerged as a big thing. I'll just say one thing: fees. I think we need to really look at ways in which to keep fees affordable. And I think that's a bigger question internationally about corporatization and all of that, and but I think what we have in India, and we are speaking here in private universities, we have this wonderful structure of public higher education, which supported by a socialist structure initiated by Nehru, which we are losing, which is kind of being destroyed. I think it's terrible. I think we went to public universities and got an excellent education for almost nothing. As a nation, we can't let go of that. Even though we are having this discussion here, a nation cannot be educated by private universities. We have to look at the public universities, which will keep education accessible and keep it away from that elitist mode. So our way of establishing trust is keeping it affordable, and we must do everything we can to explore that option.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Freshwater, Professor LEIGHTON, Professor Wilson, and Professor Majumdar, for a fantastic conversation, and also for keeping an eye on the clock. But that's all we have time for. So thank you once again, and hopefully we can pick up on these themes later on.
Bye-bye.